quick introduction to our next speaker. It's Johan Hedberg, and he's a developer and architect for integration, cloud, and enterprise solutions. He's got about 20 years of development experience, and he got his first integration influence from Bistock Server 2002. Johan has been a Microsoft Most Valued Professional for about 8 years. He works out of Stockholm, Sweden, and is currently working on Logic Apps as an enterprise integration platform, which is also part of, which is going to be represented by his talk today. In his session, Johan will be showing how to use an enterprise tooling such as Visual Studio and Visual Studio Team Services, build and release management to have a seamless chain of making changes in Visual Studio, committing and having it published in Azure. Johan will also focus on how you can structure your solutions and what you need to add to make them deployable. So there's a lot of valuable information coming your way in this session. I would strongly recommend you take your notebooks out and take some notes. Ladies and gentlemen, Johan Hedberg.
All right, thank you for that presentation. Thank you for allowing me to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about Logic Apps and continuous integration and continuous deployment. And I'm going to be showing that in Visual Studio Team Services. So I'm going to try to tie into the discussions that we've had so far around both enterprise integration and the DevOps side of things as far as deployment process goes from Visual Studio, but also then taking that further. And also kind of giving my view on what the process around enterprise integration is, not only the tooling in itself, right? So let's start by setting the stage. So I'm kind of going to try and give you kind of the idea why you would want to do this. What's the benefit of the process that I'm going to demo and that I'm going to show you? So in this example, we have Pete. So Pete identifies himself as a web developer. He's originally more of a power user. He loves the portal. Like a lot of the demos we've seen here today, it's just click, click, click. He does everything really fast. He does it, he likes to do it in production. His time to market is amazing, right? But since he does it in production, sometimes things go wrong. He'll bring down things. His quality of service might not be the highest, right? But he is fast, but he has no process. Then we have Charlotte here, and Charlotte loves Visual Studio. So she does everything Visual Studio first, second and last. So she'll use the Cloud Explorer, she'll bring the Logic app down to Visual Studio, she'll develop everything there, she'll deploy from Visual Studio, she will not use the portal at all if she doesn't want to, or if she doesn't need to, I mean. And she will also use source control. Since she's using Visual Studio, she has easy access to be able to check in her files and version them appropriately, right? And as we can hear by this short explanation, Pete and Charlotte isn't working in the same way in any sense, right? They have completely different approaches to how they do things. So if Charlotte needs to change something that Pete's doing, she'll go to the Cloud Explorer, she'll download that thing, she'll check it into source control, she'll make the change, and she'll publish it from Visual Studio. Well, if Pete's making a change, he'll make it in the portal. So this quite quickly becomes a hard situation to follow. Where's the latest code at? Is it in portal? Is it in source control? And these people aren't really working together in a common process, right? So to make things worse, let's meet Bruce, right? Bruce is the operations guy in this. So Bruce really doesn't like that Pete and Charlotte has direct access to production. He sees himself as the gatekeeper of the servers and production environments of the company, regardless if those are on-premise or cloud or whatever they are. He likes to have ITIL as a process on top of everything. He likes to approve things before they go into production. He also likes to be told, obviously, when something new is put into production, so that when someone calls him or his team saying that this and that didn't work or there was an error or something like that, he can obviously realize and understand what he has to do to get these things to work again, right? So what these people are missing is a common process and a common pipeline of how to do things. So some of the things then that this common process has to address It's not an exhaustive list in any way, but it's some of those things, right? They have to have a common development standard in some way, right? They have to be able to agree upon how do we group things. Do we use a resource group to group things? Do we use several resource groups for one integration or one solution? Do we place things in one subscription or several subscriptions? Do we develop in our MSDN subscriptions or in a joint subscription? Things like that, right? They need to agree on the process of things, right? So am I allowed to do things into production? Should I first deploy something to a test environment, have it be approved there, and then deploy it to production? Do I need to put things into source control? Should I be able to check things into the master branch, or should I be able to, create a new branch and then create a pull request? Things like that, right? And then security standards. Am I, as a developer, allowed to go into production and see all the data flowing through production? Am I allowed to have access to usernames and passwords in production, or should I just have access to the test environment and those kind of usernames and passwords? Should I be able to apply a change into production once I created one, or should that be a gated process in some way? And also deployment standards, which is the thing that I'm going to focus on here. The deployment process in this case touches on a lot of the other things as well, but it really focuses on the deployment part, which is to say, I can easily use the portal to deploy things, obviously. I can easily use Visual Studio to deploy things as well, but those are two separate ways, right? So we're going to try to find a common way of doing things, a way that's automated, because I always enjoy everything automated. And is also something that everyone can agree upon on a common level so that they don't do things completely different. And to me, there's a lot of other things that comes into play when you agree upon a process and agree upon how you do things. The team communication gets better, the team culture gets better, because all of a sudden if Pete improves his process in some way, he's improving things for him at the moment. So if they have a common process and he improves something, then he improves something for everyone, right? So just to get an idea of where I'm coming from when I'm suggesting or when I'm going to present and demo this particular solution, our architecture, our guidelines and principles focus on the fact that an integration is a resource group, or rather, a resource group will contain only one integration. And I know there are some limitations to that, but that's the guideline. There might be situations where we do differently, but that's the guideline, right? So a resource group also has a unique name in the same sense that an integration has a unique name. So that integration is self-contained and self-reliant, mostly, which is to say that it has everything inside of that resource group that it needs. Mostly, I'll come back to that. So an integration in this case will consist of one or more logic apps, one or more functions, obviously just one function app, but one or more functions. It will also consist of schemas and maps. And these are the things that I'm going to package together and have Visual Studio Team Services deploy. But it obviously also contains other things, other shared components. And to put that into a picture instead, so what I have inside my integration resource group, so that the thing that constitutes my single flow or my single integration, is obviously logic apps. It's going to be all the API connections that uses, almost all. It's going to be the functions that it uses, and it's also not really going to be the schemas and maps, but that integration package will contain those things. But on the board here, they're there to illustrate that fact. There's obviously things that I'm going to keep on a shared level. So originally, we were thinking that we would have integration accounts as part of an integration package for a specific integration as well. The way it turned out with the pricing, obviously, we're not going to do that. So that's in a shared integration resource group. And obviously, if we have some kind of shared functions, if we have some form of service bus functionality that's shared, or API management, databases, whatever that might be, operations manager, that kind of thing is in the shared infrastructure. So to put that in another way, an integration then can be, in this case, it's not, well, I'm not talking about the full integration for or the full kind of process for an application. This is more of the integration of the type where it goes from point A to point B, right? It's not something super complex. It's usually something that's quite easy. It could also be consist of multiple steps. Obviously, it doesn't just have to be point A to point B. And it doesn't really matter if that's something that's just a single logic app or if that's something that's multiple logic apps. It's still going to be something that applies to the same concept. It's going to be something that I will place in one resource group. So as far as one integration package, this is going to contain then all the logic apps, all the API connections that thing needs, all the functions, all the schemas and maps. And you might be thinking that, why is he doing that? It's just deploying these things are simple, which is true. But once you go into a mindset where you're thinking that I'm going to have not only one of those, but I'm going to have 5 of those, or I'm going to have 50 of those, or I'm going to have 500 of those, and I'm going to have a development team. Now, going back to this enterprise integration idea, that I'm going to have a development team that is going to produce a lot of these things, it kind of quickly goes to show that you can't let everyone do it their own way, because it's going to be a million different ways. You have to find some way of standardizing at the same time that you're actually helping, not hindering anyone to have these applications deployed. And so the way we're doing it also is that we have 2 separate subscriptions for doing this, right? So we will have our test subscription, which also at this point is our development subscription, and we will also have our production subscription, right? So as a developer, as Pete and Charlotte does things, they will be working inside the test environment, and obviously then Bruce is the guy who wants to keep track of the production environment. The way it used to work were that Pete and Charlotte would do things towards test or production, but he really wants to keep track of that. So again, what we really need to bring into this story here is how do we enable this in an easy manner for them? Because what we really don't want to do is as all of you guys know, we don't really want to anger Bruce, because that could be trouble, right? So the process then, before I actually go into showing you how it works, I'm going to talk about how it works. So in this case, we have Pete and Charlotte. It's fine that they're working on the tool of their choice up to some point. As we've seen earlier here, we can use either Visual Studio or we can use the portal. The important thing is that we agree upon, once they're done, what's going to be the deliveries that they need to have for us to be able to plug our automated process into that. And in this case, that's going to be the deployment package that we talked about. It doesn't really need to be a Visual Studio solution, but in my demo, in my case, it is a Visual Studio solution with multiple projects into it. It could easily just be different catalogs where the logic app and the parameter file was, or where the schemas and maps were, or where the functions is located. But in this case, it's all a Visual Studio solution. So in this case, that picture there is meant to show that they will take out a branch from the source branch or the master branch. They'll work in that. They will make a change there. And then once they're done, they will hopefully create a pull request and get that back into the master branch. And when they do that, they also need to have a build definition. And the build definition is something then that we're going to define, and we're going to look at how that looks in Visual Studio Team Services, as well as a release definition. So we're going to look at how that works too. So build obviously then is meant for them to, or meant to package all the artifacts, compile it, validate it, make sure that it's available. And the release definition then is meant to be how do we get that packaged artifacts out to one or more environments, right? So how do we get it out? Well, for test, this could be either developer initiated, or it could be continuous integration and continuous deployment. So either I push a button and say, I want to build this now, which is usually the case if I'm working in my developer branch, in my feature branch. While if I check something into master that will affect one or more integrations, the case will usually be that I'll automate that deployment. It will trigger automatically, trigger the build, and also trigger the release into the test subscription, right? But then how does that look when I go into the production side of things, where Bruce wanted control, and he wanted to be part of the process? And obviously, Pete and Charlotte wants to work with him as well, because they want everyone to be happy. They definitely want Bruce to get that 2 a.m. call when something goes wrong. They don't want to get it themselves, so they want to keep, in some sense, Bruce involved as well. So we really want to have the same artifacts and the same release deployed to production that we got into test, since hopefully in test we validated everything, we tested everything, we made sure everything works, so it's now ready to be deployed into production. So that same release that we had into test goes to production, and it gets deployed. So the difference, though, with the deployment here is that it doesn't get automatically deployed. Instead, it's a gated deployment. So in this case, Bruce will get the opportunity to actually approve this, audit this, and make sure that this is something that I'm comfortable deploying into production. This is something that I know what it is. I've read the documentation. I'm ready to support this thing, right? I'm ready to take care of it. So hopefully he will approve the change, and it then gets deployed into production. He could also at this point say that, well, I'm pushing this, and it's going to be deployed at 2 a.m. or whatever as well. So he doesn't necessarily need to say approve, do it now. He could say, approve, but defer it to 2 a.m. instead. He could also, which, that's not part of this process, but he could obviously reject it as well if there's something that's obviously wrong with it, right? So let's look at how that works. That's not what I want to look at. That's not what I want to look at. And not you either, I guess. That's what I want to look at. So I have a simple logic app. The idea here is not to show up a complex logic app or complex flow. It's easy so that we can focus on the right things. And the right things in this case is that what I have here is I have a Visual Studio solution, and it contains a logic app. And as you can see up here, it also have 2 parameter files. So we'll have 1 parameter file for test and 1 parameter file for production. For the simplicity of things here, I'm not using an API connection that needs me to log in and authorize. And I'm not using a service principal. I'm using a simple FTP call. But I'm still using something that is an API connection that will need to be configured and deployed with my solution, right? I also have a simple integration account that just contains 2 simple schemas and a map, and I do have a function down here. So the logic app in this case takes in a request. It calls that function to transform my gadget procurement to my purchase order. It then calls a function to do some validation, and it furthers that document that's been transformed to a FTP site. So, and I already have that deployed to my test environment. So it's going to send a document to this FTP site. So if I connect to that server, to the FTP site, I can see that I have 2 folders here. I have test and production. For the simplicity of things, again, here, I've dedicated one of my subscriptions to integrate, but I couldn't dedicate 2 of them to integrate, so I'm only deploying this solution twice to the same subscription. But as far as the FTP site goes, I've got 2 folders here, right? I've got the test folder, where I want files to go when I run it in test, and I have the production folder. And I've got my URL here, and I have my document here to send things into the test version of this, right? So if I send things in here, and if I refresh this site and give the logic app a moment or 2 to process it, it should hopefully soon turn up here. I'm still waiting for it. Let's go. Oh, there it is. So it turned up there. But as you can see, it's now in the wrong folder, right? What I want to do is I want it in the test folder. So I'll remove that from there, and I'll go back to Visual Studio. And what we have here is that Kevin and Jeff talked about how we need to parameterize things. So if we look at that, this logic app or this resource group template, I have a lot of parameters in this. So I'm not using variables as much as maybe I should. I'm using a lot of parameters. But I also have default values in a lot of things. So these are just default values. The designer loves default values, so I like to supply a lot of default values when I can. Those, in this case, are pointing to my test environment, or to my developer environment, if you like to think about it that way. And as we can see here in my production environment, I have a folder path parameter here that I've supplied that goes to prod, while in my test environment here I don't. So what I want to do is I want to put my test folder path in here as well. And then I want to go ahead and look at the changes and commit that message or that change. So instead of just committing, let's say commit and push. So let's go look at what we have in Windows Azure. So I have a dashboard here that's only viewing these things. And I have a resource group here that's my in00 process purchase order test. And then in that, I will have everything deployed that belongs to that integration that I just built here. So I do have my process purchase order. I have my storage with my function app needs. I have my functions app plan, and I have my actual functions app as well. And I have my SFTP test connection here as well. So this one is for test, and I'm going to obviously have another one for prod. So what I didn't look at in Visual Studio here was that what I've chosen to do here, instead of having everything inside my logic app template, is that I will actually have a separate template for deploying my function app. I will have a shared template for deploying my function app. So if you look at this, I actually have here in my integrate folder, I have a resource group template, and this is actually my resource group template, my shared resource group template, which all my integrations use when deploying functions app. So I'll have everything I need to deploy a function app in this, and each and every function in each and every integration will have their parameter files for the function. So it needs its app name, it needs its name of the service plan, and it needs its function name. So these two obviously differ between the different functions, right? No, that's not what I want. So in here, at the moment, all I have is the test logic app. So if we go over to Visual Studio Team Services then, what we can see is that I have this code in here. It's checked in. I was connected to, when I did the source control operation of committing and pushing, I was connected to this Visual Studio Team Services Git repository right here. So you can see here that this file, this logic app.test.parameters, the JSON file here, it changed 2 minutes ago. So what I also talked about us having is that we also had a build definition and we also had a release definition connected to this particular integration, right, to this particular solution. So if we go over here and look at the definitions, you can see here that it says that let's zoom that in. It says that I requested a build for this integration. This was the name of the solution, and this is also the name of this integration. So as you can see here, it says I requested a build of this just now. So what I did here is that, or what Visual Studio Team Services did here, is that in my build definition, so let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. I will have a trigger set up. This trigger says that as soon as something changes in the master branch of integrate 27 on the path filter of this particular integration, it will trigger this build, right? And what this build actually does is, again, the purpose of the build in this process is to actually package all the artifacts I need for an eventual deployment, right? So what it does is that it will build, even though it doesn't really have to, but it will build the deployment project. So that is to say the resource group template project wherein the logic app is placed. It will also make sure to copy the schemas and maps over. So again, it's not building the integration account project here. If nothing's changed, I don't think Visual Studio Team Service actually can build that project. So I'm just copying these over. I'm also copying over the functions, because that's all I need. And I am also making sure that I have this shared functions template that's it originates from a folder different than the actual integration. So I'm copying that over as well so that we can use that shared template in this process. Right, so I'm also copying over some of my scripts, some of my shared scripts, because what I want to be able to do is I want to deploy my schemas and maps, and the way I'm doing that is by using the supplied commandlets for PowerShell to push my schemas and maps up into my integration account. And we can look at that as well. So let's look at that really quickly as well. So that's this one. And it's just, yeah, my computer crashed, true. So this is just a couple of functions that I'm calling, that I'm using to make sure that I'm being able to deploy my schemas and maps and iterate over the schemas and maps that I have in the folder and deploy them. But that comes later, the actual deployment step of that. That's just this script that I'm copying over. And finally, I'm publishing this, so I'm making it available outside the process, right, for the next step in the process. So hopefully, this build has completed. It should have, well, it was crested, it was succeeded. And if I now go over to my releases, and if I refresh that as well, so you can see here also that I also have a new release over here, right? So we can look at that release, and we can see the status of that, and we can also look at the logs of that, and we can see what happened here, right? And we could go ahead and look at the definition of that. So if we go ahead and edit, we can see here that I have two environments defined for this. I have a test environment and I have a production environment. And I have 5 steps here that I go through to actually deploy this from the package artifact from my build into one of my environments. But the first thing I'd like to show here and go into detail to a little bit is that I also have something set up here for continuous deployment. So it's as easy as that. You actually tick the checkbox and you say that once this build is completed and it's successful, I want to have this artifact actually deployed up to an environment. And you can define on your environment which environment that's going to go to. So if we go back to environments, we could check on an environment here, and we can look at the deployment conditions here. So in this case, for the test environment, it says that, you know, after release creation, automatically deploy this. And it also says that as far as approval goes, you don't need any approval, it's all automatic, right? But if we look at our production environment instead, we can see here that for approval in this case, you know, and maybe this would be a specific group that you would target. They would say that it's only my production administrators that are allowed to do this. And you could easily configure that in Visual Studio Team Services, create a group that's called production administrators and allow that group to deploy to production only. But in this case, I've chosen the project administrators group. But it's a group that has to approve this, so it's not going to be automatic. You have to approve it. So let's go over here before we go into the details of what those steps do, and go to production here, and then say deploy over here. And once we do, and the idea here is that this would be Charlotte or Pete that would actually go here and say deploy, right? And once we do, obviously Charlotte and Pete wouldn't have that role, so they wouldn't be able to approve or reject. But since now I'm the project administrator and the project administrator group is the one that has it, I also get that opportunity here to say approve or reject. So again, I could either approve it, or I can reject it, or I can also say that, yeah, I approve it, but I want to have the actual deployment run sometime later, right? But I'm a nice guy. I'm not Bruce, or I am in this scenario, but I'm going to approve it. And once I approve it, it's going to start deploying to my production environment. Right? So while that's happening, because it does take a minute, roughly a minute usually is what it takes to go through these steps, I'll go down and look at what these steps actually are. So the first one of these is actually just the resource group deployment. Right? So we're taking that resource group template that we looked at, and we're pointing out a specific parameter file to use. So in the test environment case, that's going to be the test environment parameter file, and for production, it's going to be the production environment parameter file. And so what's happening there, which Jeff talked a little bit about as well, is that it's going to be a merge there between the actual logic app, or the resource group template, which contains the logic app to send my API connections, with the parameter file for that environment, so that it ends up being correctly parameterized there. And that's going to deploy, the first step here is going to, wait a minute. Sorry about that. That's actually a later step that does this. That's going to be the deployment of the logic app. So what I'm doing here in my first step is actually I'm deploying my schemas and maps. It's going to be actually a PowerShell step. So in this case, it's going to call the PowerShell that I showed you and pass in just a path where it can find the schemas and maps. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's going to deploy the Functions app. So the Functions app in this case is, before I actually copy my functions over, I need to make sure that I have my storage, that I have my plan, and that I have my Functions app available so that I can deploy something into it. So that's the second thing that's happening. And then using, and this is important here as well, using web deploy, I'm actually pushing my functions, and again I'm using one of these parameter files that I had in my let's see, where is that? No, that's where I'm using that parameter file that I had in my Functions app. So I'm using either the one for test or the one for production. And in this step, I'm just doing web deploy for the function. And then finally, the thing that I talked about a little bit earlier was that I'm deploying my logic app in my resource group template. I'm supplying that the correct parameter file as well. And then in my final step here, I'm just calling a secondary PowerShell script. All it's doing is really making sure that I have diagnostics enabled for all my logic apps. Again, that's something that I could put into my resource group template as well. But the idea here is to force every developer to do as little as possible in their specific integration scenario and have everything else outside of that handled as something shared. Something that could be the same for everyone. So that's why it looks that way. So having looked at this, while we looked at this should have deployed into production. It hasn't yet. If it isn't there yet, it's close. So it's actually on the last step here. It's deploying the function app. And this is actually one of the really good things about using VSTS as well. It's very, very easy for you to be able to look at everything it's doing, to get the logs out of that, to be able to follow your deployment. And now it's done. It's just applying the last step. So if we go back over to the portal and we refresh this, what we should see is a test resource group over here. Again, I'm placing this in the same subscription now. That's not the original idea, but I'm just using my single subscription in this case. And as you can see here, it has created all the necessary things in this resource group as well. So I have my SFTP connection, I have my functions, and I have its plan and its storage app here, and I have the logic app as well. So let's go into this logic app, because what I get out of that is just the URL of that. So let's go ahead and actually let's take that one over. So I'm just sending now the same message that I sent originally. Hopefully that will now end up into, in this case, I'm using the production URL. So what I want to see here is for this to end up into the production folder over here. Seems like it might have fallen asleep. Wait for it. Which is good, because now we can blame any, any time it takes on the FTP app and not on anything else. So there's the file. It's at 4:28, which means I have to hurry. But it's there, and that's the final part of the actual demo. So kind of the summary of that then is that this is one solution that you can use. And I really feel that a shared development practice and a shared development standard and an automated process can help you relieve a lot of those things that you have to repeat a lot of times over and over again. But it's obviously not the only way. There are a lot of options of doing this. But I really feel that Visual Studio Team Services is one way that you can definitely do this, and definitely do this for all your cloud-based, logic app-based functions and integration account solutions. So, with that in mind, that were my last ones. I'm not taking any questions now, but you can find me here, obviously, for the duration of the week. Thank you.